go anyway. I've been summoned by the family, and I was like, you know what? If I'm going to stress out, I'm going to go first class. So American Airlines offered it relatively cheap, and I was like, hell yeah, I deserve it.
I've never been in first class.
Never?
I always walk by them, and I'm like, I'm a peasant.
And one of the
Like they
common
always look
folk-
at me like fucking peasant.
Yeah, it was like a $92 upgrade. I mean,
Damn.
that's a lot of money, I grant you, but I was
No,
like,
that's pretty dang cheap for
like for
like
my
a
mental
first class
health.
upgrade. A lot of times it's like $500-$600 at least
Yeah, I'm
that
taking
I've
like,
seen.
yeah, they can be pretty expensive, but it's probably because it's a very early flight. It's like a 7 a.m. flight, so I might not have a lot of competition.
Yeah, I
for
was
first
just in
class.
DC, and it was like the first time I got 2 flights that were past 11 a.m. and it was great.
Yeah, I know I have to get up so early tomorrow and get to the airport.
And you're there a couple of days.
Oh yeah, I'm only going to be there through Wednesday. It's a very brief trip. Yeah.
DC it just kind of rained a lot while I was there. It's a weird trip when there's this short weekend flight trip and then you go there and it's just raining.
What are you doing there?
A friend was there. A friend lives there now. So we ate and then we went to like a couple museums. Went to the Holocaust Museum.
Oh God, that's depressing.
But they didn't have the pile of shoes. It's bullshit.
Oh, like from the Larry David show?
Oh, I don't know. There was just supposed to be like a shoe room, but they're what is it called? Not repairing. They're
Oh, I've seen that. Yeah, they have it at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. At least they did at one point. There was a Holocaust exhibit, like as part of the World War II Museum. Yeah. So Curb Your Enthusiasm last season, Larry David had a bit about the pile of shoes. It was horrible, but in his very irreverent style of humor.
That's funny. Did you have a session at 10, you said?
Yeah, at 10.
How can we best use our time today? Give you a therapist question.
Oh my God. Well, tell me something that you're learning. Are you taking any classes, courses, reading any books?
No, I'm not doing that. I'm reading a lot of fiction.
I mean, that can be helpful, like thematically, symbolically.
I mean, yeah. I think in reflecting on that, I do read a lot of fiction, kind of with a science fiction theme, that oftentimes is thematic to like multiverse or time. Very rarely is the stuff I read like written in a linear way. And I kind of wonder if that, I mean, I know it definitely has an impact on how I view others, but how I've viewed myself or like my own lifespan, how I don't see life as like some kind of, I mean, it is linear, but also if you spend a life reflecting and processing like past, current, and future, and that's like a big part of life, it stops being as linear. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I could kind of wonder about that. Like, I think I probably am attracted to that kind of genre because it represents a lot of how I view my own life, but also how I process stories with clients. So it's not, oftentimes a story is like, a client's story is more abstract and thematic and non-linear, as opposed to like, I was born in 1943, and then my dentist pulled my first tooth when I was 5.
Yeah. And
and so I think maybe too is reading that kind of genre indicates that I think of life in a, I guess, more an opportunist way, where it's like not, you don't have to be locked and stuck and defined by like an event, even if it's a very, very big event. That people and myself still have like the capacity and flexibility to overcome or shift or change beyond that event. And I think reading genre like that reinforces that type of belief system. So I think, yeah, that's what we're talking. I think it probably does improve like my ability not just to have hope and empathy for clients, but also to buy in to change, to buy into the change. I think if I'm a therapist, I'm not bought in that the client can change, I'm wasting their time.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I think it too. I think
which
reading,
book are you reading?
I think a couple, but I think reading fiction too, like it helps with my memory of client stories. Kind of keeps me in that like space. Because if you're reading, you have to keep up with all these different like lines of story and like characters and personalities, and it like it's a way to massage the therapy listening muscle without working. It's like a recreational therapeutic muscle strengthening.
Oh yeah, and I think clients really appreciate it when you can remember, their great aunt's name or something like that.
A trick I've learned too is if you don't think don't say it. If you're like, was her aunt Gertrude? I'm not sure. I'll just say your aunt. I was reading there's a writer, Blake Crouch, that writes like page turners that I've been reading. It's a lot of like science fiction, like multiverse type stuff. I was trying to read Of Mice of Men.
Oh, I love that book. Oh my God, it's such a good story.
It was so late last night. I was trying to read, and I was like, I'm not in it right now. The prose, but I might. I mean, it's a short book, so I'll probably read it.
I haven't read John Steinbeck in a very, very, very long time, but yeah, that was one of my favorites. Grapes of Wrath, of course, I love that one. But I got to get back into reading fiction because I just read so much that's relevant to our profession. Like that's what I have to do. I have to do my license renewal this year, and so I found these book studies that I'm going to do, book study programs. So you read the book, then you take a test, and then you get your CEUs.
Yeah, I should probably do that. My CEU taking is a fucking joke. I have like a subscription. It's like $60 a year, and it's some bullshit.
What is it through?
I don't know. I don't remember. Oh. Like onlineceu.com or something.
I think I've used something like them.
It's just because I've lost so much faith in CEU experience, especially like virtually. Like I've paid and tried to be serious about CEUs, and just it'd be like you take one on multiculturalism and it's a fucking intro slide. It's just
okay.
a waste
I can't
of time.
do those. I have to do something that's very like niche specific.
Yeah, send me some stuff or like a resource, because I don't know where to go.
Okay, so if you really want to like blow your mind, I highly recommend anything with Robin Shapiro. She does EMDR, but her trainings are also geared towards those who've not been trained in EMDR. But hers is Easy Ego State Interventions. That's one of her courses. She's a treasure. This woman is so eccentric and so authentic. She's like an institution unto herself.
Yeah, you mentioned Ego State last podcast, right? I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Robin Shapiro, Ego State. That's like the training.
Yes, yeah. I would get the one with her training it because she's just so.
Is it like is it live or is it a followed course?
It's live.
Okay.
The best one was live, and like I guess they have like a behind the scenes person who can pair people off virtually into like their own little chat rooms, and then you practice in your own little chat rooms.
Yeah, I need to get on board with taking C's a little more serious.
I just took a really great one this past Friday, all about, let me get it right here. Although this one's more EMDR specific. Using EMDR to address pre-verbal trauma with an early developmental approach.
Pre-verbal trauma?
Pre-verbal trauma from 0 to 3.
So what's the
How do you
basis
do that?
of that approach?
Okay, so yes, it's all based upon implicit memory, because obviously people when they're 0 to 3 don't have explicit memory. So it's a felt sense or based upon the stories of their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we all have stories that were told to us, and sometimes how those stories are told can reveal more about the context in which you were raised or born than sometimes the actual story itself. But so it is kind of also using storytelling to desensitize people's experiences from that age. So like if people have a felt sense that, because their parents got divorced at 5, when they were 5, they know that their parents had, marital trouble sometime between 0 to 3. And so there might have been like a lot of yelling in the house or something like that. And so the actual memory target that is targeted with bilateral stimulation is that each developmental phase. So you have to so it just goes through a series of questioning, just asking the client about the felt sense regarding that developmental age. So it's done chronologically.
So do you create like event pathway? Like how do you create touchstones to the memory if it's implicit?
Okay. That's a very good question.
Haha.
Let me turn to my slides. Okay.
Because oftentimes if you have like an explicit memory, you could use
easy.
A touchstone of like
yes.
Hey, this happened at this oak tree. All right, envision the oak tree.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, explicit memories are easy to reprocess. The implicit ones are more challenging because it's even more subjective than an explicit memory. Okay, so to set up the target, so the target is the time period. So let's just say like the person had birth trauma. They know they had birth trauma because that's part of the story, like the family lore. So the mom had an emergency C-section, let's just say. Okay. So you would set that up by just saying, let's just talk about birth. And then you would ask, what do you get a sense about your birth? And then based upon then the client would have to self-reflect and just they would have to say like, oh, okay, I feel very like rushed, pressured, some like they just use adjectives like that. And then you can target the wording with the bilateral stimulation. So the therapist isn't doing very much at all, but leading them through like a structured interview. And then
so the
adding
implicit
bilateral
memory
stimulation.
is often informed by family or others that witnessed the birth.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that creates another dynamic where it depends on the caretaker's own distress tolerances of trauma.
Exactly. And so like if a parent is highly dysregulated caring for a newborn, that's going to get encoded in the newborn's neurobiology, that stress.
But also the neurobiology, but also like I'm thinking if a mother, you could have two variants of the mother or a lot more than that, but for a simple conversation, you could have one that has like a higher sense of like security and safety describing to their child the C-section versus a mother that is highly fearful and maybe has her own previous medical trauma prior to C-section. Her storyline of that experience would be vastly different than the one that felt secure and safe.
Exactly. Exactly. And
So
so,
it's the biological, but also like the psychological component that would influence the infant's story of that experience as they aged.
yes, yes. And so, like, in that moment, though, of reprocessing, what's also very key is the therapist's ability to attune to the client. And so, it's that attunement, that entrainment that naturally happens that's also healing. So, it's like two vehicles are healing the bilateral stimulation as the client imagines the felt sense of that time period, and then also the attunement the therapist has with the client.
So explain me the bilateral stimulation. That's the tapping.
The tapping, it depends upon what can be tolerated by the client. So it can be literal eye movements, like where the therapist moves his or her hand back and forth like this, and then the client follows with his or her eyes. Or if sometimes clients just can't tolerate that, like especially those who have seizure disorder, they can tap, do the butterfly hug by tapping. Other clients will say something like, in one of the training videos, the client had this, it was like a somatic urge to just like sway, almost like they were in a swing, like if you think one of those
rocking
infant swings
or something.
Yeah, but rocking in and of itself isn't bilateral, so you have to stand up. So she had to stand up and then like alternate her feet, swaying back and forth like
so
this.
Is that like a somatic experience that reprograms the unsafe space, or what's
Yes.
the functionality?
So we're removing material information from the amygdala, very simplistically, to the hippocampus.
Right.
And then that's what the bilateral stimulation does, is actually facilitates that movement from that one structure to the hippocampus. But then sometimes the somatic also comes out because trauma can be encoded such in the body that movement can actually participate in releasing it.
Yep.
So yeah, I do have clients that might rock back and forth like this to kind of like soothe their nervous system to stay within their window of tolerance while doing some sort of bilateral stimulation.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so it's an interesting approach because like this approach to EMDR is really best for clients who have been in psychotherapy for like years and years and years with no movement, no change in their presentation or symptoms, because it really works at more of what's called a bottom-up approach to trauma-focused care, rather than like, cognitive behavioral therapy, don't get me wrong, has its place, but that's a top-down approach. That's like approaching the client from their intellectual side, their adult side. But what EMDR, at least with the early attachment wounding, tries to get at is the earliest development from the relational standpoint of the therapist and client, as well as from just sort of imagining these time periods and these felt senses of what happened to them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be intellectual, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, as a therapist, our treatment should be modeled by client feedback, and often the clients that I get have had a lot of experience in therapy, and they, not in those words, but they do pretty much explain their experience that way, the top-down approach. And often with clients that have severe anxiety or like supposed panic disorder, and through listening to their needs, I adjust based on that, obviously. And I've noticed that this whole idea of thought processing and intellectualizing is at best a Band-Aid. So going into the emotional relational realm is something that I like lean into with pretty much every client. It's almost like there's a time and place for CBT or intellectual scaffold, but if the relational emotional realm isn't isn't seen or experienced, it's like an illusion of therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, because then it just feels like you've been invited to a TED Talk. Because I have a client who this is like her, it's like a defense mechanism. It's like defensive structure. She'll come into session and just basically rant. And that, I have to really practice that therapeutic cutoff, because though I do recognize she's ranting to think her way into safety. But I have to think about this neurobiologically, is that even though what she's saying is logical and it fits in with like her worldview, she's dysregulated.
The way it feels for me as a therapist when people are ranting like that is it's like you walk into a room and they have this huge canvas and like a palette knife, and they're like frantically going and grabbing paint and like doing all these things and showing you what it's supposed to be. And you're just sitting there like, can we say hello?
Yeah.
like it's like you're just watching them and they're just frantically like scraping the knife everywhere and like trying to create this structure that it ends up looking like a blob. And you're like, hey, we don't have to start right there. We can just like shake hands.
Yeah. I just think that the clients can just be so dysregulated that they cannot often access the social engagement, right? Because they're already kind of in fight or flight. And so that's like the ranting is how I know she's in, even though she's not physically fighting anybody, she's in fight mode, because she's like just desperate to get across her point of view and have me as the therapist agree and validate. But then that's what keeps people in therapy for decades, is that they have therapists who just like listen to the rant, agree with them, validate, do
Summarize.
some Rogerian, summarize. And then it's like, okay, well, I feel better. I've expressed myself. But it's like, okay, but have you really made any movement towards resolving the underlying issues?
I've also heard from clients that they've recently been in therapy and they're frustrated because the therapist has like shown them box breathing or a 5 senses technique for grounding, but they're expected to apply that skill when they're activated, as opposed like prior to having any kind of like emotional or relational like trust in the what I would call like the snowball before the avalanche. So in activation, that's the avalanche that you can't really stop and it's breaking trees. The snowball is all this other stuff and sensory that the client isn't aware of prior to the avalanche. And you can obviously stop a snowball falling from a hill faster than an avalanche or more effectively. So it's like you have to meet in that relational space where the snowball is and begin to apply stuff there, as opposed to like when someone's flooded. So clients get a lot of frustration when they're asked to do some kind of simple grounding technique they could find on Google whenever they're in panic. It doesn't affect, like, that's going back to the hippocampus versus amygdala.
Exactly. It's very difficult to access that intellectual understanding when you are, having a sympathetic nervous system reaction.
And that comes from like therapists just saying, okay, they have panic, they need grounding, let's teach them this box breathing skill. And that doesn't work.
No,
I don't think. I mean, I haven't heard that it's worked from clients. We'll say that.
Yeah. Well, it has to come with an understanding of, okay, the self-knowledge has to be developed also. Like a client has to understand, okay, so what are my triggers for ending up in that panic?
Right.
How
what are the snowballs, basically?
Yeah, what are the snowballs? Like, what are and then having that understanding of what can help them move out of that sympathetic nervous system activation back down to the ventral vagal, to the green zone of being calm and calmer, safe. That's where the knowledge is. And I think that once that is developed, that understanding of self, then maybe those techniques can start to help.
And part of that important intellectual side, I think, is it would be with like a client that maybe defines their entire experience as anxiety. When they're activated, they label it anxiety. So the entire experience is just anxiety. There's no ability to define, much less experience anything beyond the activation, because it's like 0 to 100, and expanding their emotional intelligence by defining and identifying stuff that happens, signals that happen prior to the activation is paramount. And the unsettling part is often when I do that with clients, like sometimes I'll even invite in a rule of like, okay, today, anytime that you think of the term anxiety, we're going to attempt to define that in a different way. We're going to use a different feeling, because often anxiety is the umbrella term. So
yeah,
that's another way to like expand their lexicon to then, because if you can't identify something that's prior to the activation, how are you ever going to notice its signal before you get activated? So I think that's the intellectual part of it, is like we have to define terms that predate the avalanche, the activation, the unsafe space. And it's unsettling because a lot of times when I do that with clients, it's a foreign territory, which is just backwards in my way of working. Because I'm like, this is like the first part. How is this a foreign landscape? Like this is entering the trailhead for me. Like, where else do you start if you don't start there? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think understanding all of the components that comprise anxiety, it takes time to break that apart and break that down and develop, for the client to develop his or her own insight. But you're right, it is an umbrella term oftentimes for something.
We as therapists
something's in danger. Yes, they're in danger in some way, shape, or form.
We as therapists have to move away from the way in which they, like, it's a balance where, yes, I need to get into their way of conceptualizing their struggle, but also I can't stay in that world fully.
Mm-hmm.
Like, staying in that world fully is, okay, anxiety, panic, okay, let's find grounding and boxing. Let's treat this symptom. That's me joining the world and staying in it. It's like we have to keep that distance. Going with the avalanche metaphor, it's like we have to be in the helicopter watching it. We can't like get into the chaos and try to stop the snow just because they're gonna suffocate. Like we have to.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, there is that. Because sometimes clients do show up in session with this desperation for the therapist to fix it. Whatever it is, just fix it. And I think,
for example, in session, it would be like, this happened recently. A client, we went to more of like an emotional relational place. They had a lot of experience with panic, and they like warned me that they were going to have they were like, I think I'm going to have a panic attack. And I'm like, okay, let's have one. Giving him permission, because I think meeting in that space, it's like, oh no, we're having a panic attack. I'm in this avalanche too. We need to survive together. Let's get you some breathing techniques to bring you down from this activated space. Yet, that's the content of the experience. The process would be like thinking in a systemic way, where it's like, how do others usually respond to this warning? What are they trying to do? How could we do something in a different way that would like exercise a comfort and a confidence in the client to have this experience and overcome it? So it like kind of innately came to me as providing permission and confidence and safety for that activation to occur. And in doing that, they didn't have a panic attack.
Yeah, because I think you're meeting them at a relational place that they're probably not used to or don't experience consistently. Like, I'm just trying to think about that from like a neurobiological standpoint. And yeah, I think that attachment that developed in that moment, like a secure attachment, or approximated one at least, probably brought them back down. Unless you think that the term panic attack and like the warning that I'm going to have a panic attack has some secondary gains to it.
Yeah, I think in some cases it could.
Yeah.
In this case, I think they were just afraid of continuing. And so their body signaled like danger. And then they communicated that. And then I'm like, oh, we're not in danger. It's all right. I just think like a therapist that's not more in tune with the emotional and relational side of it and the process side of it could have very easily in that moment went into CBT, thought stopping, or box breathing, or five senses technique, which I think unintentionally signals to the client that, oh no, you were in danger, and we have to do this thing. We have to evac you out of here with a helicopter.
Okay. So like in that situation, just broadly speaking, of course, with no specifics, like what would you have said was possibly the underlying feeling the client was trying to avoid, possibly through the vehicle of a panic attack? Like, what was the danger?
Emotional vulnerability.
Okay.
Like, yeah, I think the emotional entrainment, vulnerability, and like connection that was being fostered. Because also, if the therapist becomes preoccupied with the anxiety, it creates a distraction from the emotional vulnerability. Okay,
so like now I'm putting what you're saying like into my schema, so to speak. Okay, so then, oh God, my thought just flew away like a butterfly. Okay, so then if emotional vulnerability, okay, so then that client possibly was like on uneven ground as to whether or not to trust you in that moment. And then when you were like, I can handle it, I can handle if you have a panic attack, that sort of like bolstered the client's confidence in you that you're trustworthy.
Yeah, and it's I think it's a powerful approach because it also signals to the client, okay, that panic exists in your life, yet we know it's a distraction from these other spaces, and we don't have to be distracted. Because by that approach, in previous session we had already like articulated and intellectually understood the process of his experience with panic and how it at times pulls him away from emotional vulnerability or vocalizing or expressing, and how he then becomes like distracted by the anxiety, and then his girlfriend might become distracted by the anxiety, his family members might be distracted by the panic. So that had already been like intellectually defined. So then when he was in that space, we were referring back to those conversations as opposed to visiting them for the first time in that moment. And it's not as though he went back into that emotional vulnerability. It was like another reminder and iteration of the process. So it didn't like pull him right back into that emotional space, but what it did is it's like I gave him permission to have the panic. He didn't. And instead of returning back to that emotional vulnerability space, I think it was therapeutic in that he had that experience of feeling fearful that panic was going to happen. And then being with himself and me to signal, it's okay. You can have this. It's not gonna kill you. I'm not scared by it, and neither are you. So I think that was the reparative part for that moment. Unfortunately, in a perfect world, he could have heard me and then returned back to that emotional vulnerability. But it's one of those needing more experiences types of situations, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, sounds like you did very good work.
See, I make it sound really good afterwards. It's not as good in the moment.
Hopefully your notes sound as good as that,
What notes?
It's so funny. I had a client the other day. She made a comment. She says, "I've had lots of counseling before, but I've never had psychotherapy." And I was like, that was a really nice compliment.
You should put that in your note.
I should. Take that, insurance company.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about. It's been a very salient experience of mine with a number of clients lately. They've had like the severe anxiety and the ongoing counseling experience where the counselor is meeting them in the anxiety and trying to treat that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it just doesn't, it's not very effective, I don't think.
It's not. Like the parallel for that comment to me is like, like doctors who only treat the symptoms but don't get to the underlying cause of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very frustrating. That just feels like kicking the can down the road.
That's often how I frame the approach that we partake in with treating the anxiety or the severe depression, is I often will frame it in a medical, somatic, or physical realm because it's easier for people to understand. And I think that's another confusing part of treatment is, people understand that like the symptom-based treatment for a physical issue does not treat the actual person or like the holistic healing of that wound. Yet in psychotherapy and the invisible pains, humans are startled that symptom-based treatment is ineffective. Like
right.
It's like expected that we should treat the anxiety and that's what we need to treat. But if I cut my right leg and then realize my left foot is hurting now, I realize it's not my left foot, it's my right leg, and I'm compensating on my left heel. Like humans can like conceptualize that pretty easily, but with trauma, it's backwards. We're not able to like effectively conceptualize the symptom versus the core wound, and often I think the anxiety and the infatuation with it pulls us further and further away from defining the wound in the first place. So the client may not even have, that's going back to expanding their emotional lexicon. They don't even have the words or the pathways to tell the therapist what the wound is.
Yes.
And we have to provide that space and verbiage to reconstruct it.
Well, I highly recommend anybody to do a deep dive into polyvagal theory because I think that helps give like language to people's experience, especially language that they can take with them to go speak with medical professionals about whatever might be going on.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately I feel like my counseling program just did not do a very good job in teaching the neurobiological components to what we envision as, psychiatric illness.
Well, it's the sad thing of the profession is if you're able to master paraphrasing, summarizing, reflection of feeling, you are better than a lot of counselors.
And that's like the ground floor.
That's pretty bleak, but I think that's why like the master's programs are predominantly focused on that because as a client, if I'm going into a room and they're able to do that consistently, I've hit the jackpot. Because there's a lot of people that don't provide that. Because then you have to go into like, therapists that share their opinions, or they're unaware of their biases. And
what were the four again? Summary. What did you say?
Like summary, paraphrase, reflection. Did I say a fourth one? I think it was just
I thought
three.
you did. Oh, okay. Reframing.
But those are like the main tenets of like active listening in therapy. And I think as a trainer, if you can get a new counselor to fully enact those in session, you've won.
Well, I got to wrap this up because I got a client in 5 minutes. I'm sorry for
No, you're good.
Seeming like I'm chasing another butterfly, but
good to chat a little. Now you're gonna hit this one out of the park.
I am. I've been.
You're firing on all four cylinders now. You're gonna hear my voice in the session. Cool. Well, good luck and have a fun trip, and we'll try to set something up for next week or something.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks very much.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.